Welcome to Module 3. This week we are going to be paying attention to Genesis 12 through 50. This first lecture is going to talk about the Abraham cycle, and then the next lecture posted in this module will talk about the Jacob cycle and say a few things about the Joseph story as well. I'm great that you are here. I have appreciated your participation in the course, and I look forward to interacting with you in this module also. Let's begin with prayer. O God, long ago you called your servant Abraham and sent him to a foreign land with the promise that he would be the father of a great nation, the people who would become the nation of Israel. Then in the fullness of time you sent your Son, so that we too could be grafted onto that tree and be part of your covenant people. Thank you, God, for this amazing love. Help us to respond with lives of worship, holiness, and faith through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. You will remember that in the last module, the last passage we looked at was the story of the Tower of Babel, and then leading into the genealogy that would take us up to the family of Abram. We said that the Tower of Babel story, like a couple of the other stories in that primeval history, had some important elements pertaining to the people's relationship with God and their disobedience to his commands. We saw that there was an act of disobedience in that story. We saw that there was God's pronouncement of punishment. We saw that there was the actual punishment where the people were sent away. But we said that the one element from some of these stories that was missing in the Tower of Babel story was what we had called the amelioration of the consequences of the sins that the people had committed. We said that in the story of Cain and Abel and in the story of the Garden of Eden, in each of those cases, God had undertaken an act of grace or mercy to lessen the effect of the sin and the punishment. But we said that there was no such element in the story of the Tower of Babel. However, I'd suggested that what happens is that the rest of the book of Genesis instead fills that spot, the amelioration of punishment. God's act of grace and mercy is going to be that now God is going to press forward by forming a particular special relationship with one person and with one family, and allowing that family to grow into one nation who would be his own people. So it's as if God is no longer dealing with all of creation, but God is focusing his attention primarily on one family, with the provision, of course, that that family would also bring great blessing to all the families of the earth. And so as we get to the end of chapter 11 in Genesis, the Abraham cycle is technically going to start in chapter 11, verse 27, where the writer tells us, now these are the descendants of Terah. Every time we have that phrase, these are the descendants of, in Genesis, where it occurs 12 times, it marks the beginning of a new section of the book. As usual, of course, I don't have time to say nearly everything I would like to say about all of these stories, and I don't have a chance to address all of them with you today. So in this video lecture, there are 4 points that I would like to focus on in particular. The first would be the historical background of the patriarchal narratives. I won't say a lot about that, but just a little. Secondly, I would like to focus on Genesis 12 and show you how that sets the stage for the rest of Genesis and really for the rest of the Pentateuch. Third, we'll take a look at the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 15 through 17. Fourth, we'll take a look at the realization of God's promise in Genesis 20 through 22. So to begin talking a little bit about the geographical and historical background, you might remember that in Module 1, we said that the patriarchs can be dated roughly to the period of time from 2000 BC to 1550, what historians often describe as the Middle Bronze Age. Genesis chapter 11, verses 27 to 32, place that family down here in the city of Ur. And as the story begins, they undertake some travels. Historians tell us that in 1950 BC, Ur was finally defeated by a group of people called the Elamites. And this led to a lot of what we call Amorite influence in the Fertile Crescent during the first half of the second millennium. That means the Amorites were Semitic peoples who are going to be traveling through that area and who are going to be filtering in from various places. And so there's going to be a lot of movement and a lot of transition during the ancient Near East at this time. The migration of Abraham really fits this pattern of Amorite movements, as do the trips that Abraham and the other patriarchs take back and forth between Haran and Israel. John Bright, the Old Testament historian, suggests that the patriarchs were semi-nomads living in tents like so many other people in the world at that time. We're not going to address the history of this area in detail, but I am going to ask you to pay some attention to the articles in both of your primary textbooks about it. Most textbooks tend to be pretty heavily historically based, and so I'm going to let you get a lot of your historical information from that. And I'm going to focus more on the literary and theological information as we look together at how the biblical text itself is put together. Before we move on to that, however, just let me say a couple more things about historical research pertaining to the patriarchs. And first of all, there, of course, has been a lot of debate and discussion among scholars about the historical reliability of the patriarchal narratives. How closely do these stories represent events that were going on in the world at that time? Again, the historian John Bright says that there are fairly good indications that these stories do reflect the time period in which they are set, and so they do reflect a lot of memories of that time period that the authors would have had. For example, Bright says that even the names Abram, Isaac, and Jacob are much more common during the early second millennium than they would be at any other time. And so they fit better in the period of time where the author places them than they would fit at any other time. John Bright says that some of the things that happen in Genesis pertaining to social customs like marriage and maidservants and family life and things like that, these are all represented as well in other second millennium cultures. And so a lot of the literature from around the ancient Near East at that time is going to talk about traditions that match fairly closely what we read about in the book of Genesis. One important location where a lot of these texts were found is going to be right here in the city of Mari. A whole trove of tablets written in the language of Akkadian were uncovered, and they bear some interesting parallels to what we are going to find in the Old Testament and Genesis in particular. The scholar Kenneth Kitchen points out that another reason to suppose that there's a lot of interest on the part of the authors in being historically accurate is that in Genesis we see that these patriarchs are doing things that are prohibited in later times, such as marrying two sisters, for instance. Kitchen mounts the argument that if the story about the patriarchs was pretty much composed out of whole cloth, too many centuries later, it is highly doubtful whether that they would have made up a story about heroes of the faith doing things that later on would be prohibited. Other scholars, such as John Van Seters, are going to are going to denigrate the historical reliability of the patriarchal stories. For example, he's going to point out that when it talks about Edom, that really is out of place, that reflects the time of David rather than the time of the patriarchs. He's going to argue that the Philistines in this area here along the Mediterranean coast did not arrive until 1200, and so again, it would have been impossible for Abraham to have encounters with them in the book. And he's also going to say that terms like Amorites, Hittites, Horites, and Canaanites, all of which are mentioned in these stories, really did not exist until a later period of time. So there are kind of both of the arguments laid out for you. Again, I think Dr. Arnold does an excellent job of probably laying out the arguments both ways and of suggesting a conclusion, and so I would commend that to you and encourage you to study that. Having looked a little bit at the historical background and the maps, let's jump into the text itself. One of the key passages in the entire Old Testament is going to be Genesis 12, chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Let's read together. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." This really is the passage that sets the stage for the rest of Genesis, and really I think we could say for the rest of the Pentateuch. God sends Abram forth from the land of Haran to go down to the land of Canaan, a place where he has never been before, a place where there are different people living there, a place where there's going to be a lot of difficulty awaiting him and a lot of challenges. God does not let the fact that Abram is 75 years old, drawing Social Security and playing golf every afternoon, exclude him from God's call to go to this new country. And so God sends Abram from Haran down to Canaan, and as he does so, he sends him out with 3 promises. The first promise is going to be land, which is going to become more explicit a little bit further down in the passage. The second promise that God gives Abram here in these verses we read is descendants. Abram will be the father of a great multitude of people, a great nation. And then blessing is going to be the third promise. God is going to bless Abram, but not only will God bless Abram, but God is also going to use Abram as a blessing to a lot of other peoples. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So even though, as Dr. Arnold points out in his commentary on Genesis, even though God is now moving his focus from the cosmos as a whole to one particular family, that does not mean that God has forgotten about the rest of the nations. Instead, God is going to bless all of those other nations through the actions of Abram. In the churches that I've served, I've always found this to be a wonderful passage to preach on in my very first Sunday in a pulpit. It gives me an opportunity to remind the congregation that they have been blessed and that I have been blessed by becoming their pastor, and that with God's blessing of us is going to be the opportunity to bless others, and pray that God will use us as a blessing for others and that we would act accordingly. The pastor of the church that I'm serving now has just been moved to a new appointment, and she told me that she also is going to be preaching on this same passage on her first Sunday in her new congregation. The rest of the book of Genesis then is going to be devoted to showing how these promises are fulfilled or not fulfilled in spite and in the midst and in the face of all these obstacles that are going to be put in the way. Let me say that one more time. This passage is kind of the thesis statement that sets the agenda for the rest of Genesis. The rest of the book is going to be about showing how this promise of land, descendants, and blessing will be fulfilled or not fulfilled because of all of the obstacles that they are going to find in their way. And so the first obstacle to the fulfillment of this promise of land, descendants, and blessing is going to be right in Genesis 13, or right in Genesis 12 itself, immediately after this passage. And interestingly enough, this first obstacle to the fulfilling of this promise is going to be something that is brought about by what Abraham himself does. It tells a story about Abram and Sarai going down to Egypt to escape a famine. And so that kind of becomes, doesn't it, the first obstacle to the promise. No sooner does Abram get to the land of Canaan, build a couple of altars and worship God, then he has to leave that land and go down to Egypt. And so now already Abram is off the land that God had promised to give him. And it begins to raise suspense in the mind of the readers. How is God going to be able to fulfill this promise? And how reliable is God when he gives Abram a promise of land and then immediately Abram has to leave that land? So Abram and Sarai go down to Egypt, and once again there is an obstacle to that promise, and this time, as I said, it's caused by Abram's own foolish actions. Remember the story as they are going down. Abram is afraid that the people of Egypt are going to see Sarah's great beauty and that the king of Egypt is going to want Sarai to be part of his harem, and so he's going to kill Abram so he can have Sarai. Of course, the solution they come up with is that Abram tells Sarai, "Why don't you say you're my sister?" Thinking that then if the Pharaoh wanted her, at least the Pharaoh would not kill Abram himself to get her. And so that's the story that they come up with. And right there, because of Abram's own foolish actions, he almost loses his wife as Sarai is taken into the harem of Pharaoh, just as he had feared. What is the status of the promise? How can this promise of land, descendants, and blessing come true when Abram has thrown it away right from the outset? However, we read in chapter 12, verse 17, that the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Notice the parallels to another part of the story that we will read later. A great famine causes some people to go from Canaan down to Egypt, where they get themselves into trouble, and God sends plagues to let them get out. And so because of these plagues, Pharaoh figures out what's going on. He gives Sarai back to Abram and lets them go. And of course, Abram gets to keep all of the flocks and the herds and everything that Pharaoh had paid him as a dowry of sorts, so that he could marry Abram's quote unquote sister. So the story of Genesis is going to continue. We're going to skip over chapters 13 and 14, which talk about Lot, so we can get to chapters 15, 16, and 17. And once again, we're going to see that in these chapters, there is an obstacle to the promise. And of course, this time the obstacle to the fulfillment of land, descendants, and blessing is going to be Sarai's own barrenness. They don't have any children, and so the conversation begins in chapter 15, where the Lord says to Abram, "Don't be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great." But then going to go on, and Abram is going to introduce the problem. "O Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." Eliezer would have probably been a servant or a slave that was living in Abram's household. And laws at the time provided for the possibility of taking a slave as your heir if you did not have children of your own. And it seems that Abram has already accepted that that's what's going to happen. But of course, God instead takes Abram out, tells him to count the stars, and says your own descendants, meaning your own biological descendants from your very own DNA, are going to be the ones who are going to possess this land. The rest of the story of chapter 17 is going to, or of chapter 15, I'm sorry, is going to go on and explain the covenant that God is going to make with Abram. And some of our textbooks point out that this covenant passage has a unique structure. First, God states what the promise is. Then Abraham questions that promise. And then God responds to Abraham's questioning. And finally, Abraham is going to believe. I would encourage you to take a look at your assigned reading for this time in terms of this strange ceremony which they have to sort of seal this covenant between them and what it all means. What's interesting now is that even though God has made this covenant between God and between himself and Abram, we're going to see that Abram still is having some trouble believing, isn't he? And so that brings us to the whole matter of the Ishmael story in chapter 16. Immediately after God has made this great and wonderful covenant with Abram that he will be the father, the ancestor of a great nation of people, what does he do? Instead of waiting for for God to fulfill his promise, Abram and Sarai instead cook up this plan where Abram is going to go and have a child through the maidservant Hagar. And again, according to laws of that time, as a member of Abram's household, since the mother's a slave of Abram's household, then Ishmael himself would be considered Abram's child in a sense and would be eligible to inherit his fortune. And so Ishmael is born. And the interesting thing is that Ishmael's mother Hagar is told that God has not forgotten about him, that he too will be the father of a great nation of people, but they will not be the covenant people that God will still bring from Abraham. However, even in spite of Abraham's lack of faith and his stubborn refusal to believe, God is still not going to give up on Abraham. And so, once again, in Genesis 17, we're going to have a story about this covenant between God and Abram. These are probably two different stories from two different sources about the covenant. The story in chapter 15, that is Jay's version of how this covenant takes place. Chapter 17, Dr. Arnold says, was probably written by the writer of the Holiness Code, or the Holiness Writers, whom he calls H, which really is a part of the complex that we call P. So we have Jay's version of the covenant in chapter 15 and P's version of the covenant in chapter 17. And in chapter 17, this covenant is going to include, first of all, a declaration of who God is. Then it's going to go on and declare God's covenant obligations. Once again, God promises him that he will make him the ancestor of a mighty nation. And then the story is going to go on and highlight what Abraham's covenant obligations are. And in this case, it's going to be circumcision as a sign of Abraham's faithfulness. He's supposed to circumcise the male children. We're also going to have a blessing for Sarah in verses 15 to 16. And so the promise belongs not only to Abram, but to both of them together. And then finally, at the end of the story, God addresses Ishmael. In verse 18, Abraham had said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight." And God had said, "No, but your wife Sarah shall bear you a son. You shall name him Isaac." But Ishmael is also given a promise from God. So once again, we see that in terms of his faith and his willingness to trust in God, or his ability to trust in God, Abraham is still not there, right? God repeats this wonderful covenantal promise to Abraham, and all Abraham can do is laugh, as he does in verse 17, and then tell God how God should do it. Tell God that your plan isn't really going to work out, God. Instead, you should just count on Ishmael as being the child of the promise. Dr. Arnold, in his commentary on Genesis, suggests that all covenants have two elements, promise and obligation. Promise and obligation. Some covenants are going to focus more strongly on one or the other. For instance, this covenant here with Abram is going to focus most strongly on promise. This is about God's promise. And later on, we'll see some that will focus more on the element of obligation. Finally, let's go on to chapters 20 through 22, where we're going to see that the promise will finally be realized. In chapter 20, we're going to have this wife-sister trick that Abraham and Sarah by now are going to pull again, this time not in Egypt, but at Gerar. And then finally, in chapter 21, we're going to have the birth of Isaac. I've always been kind of struck because the writer seems so matter of fact when he finally describes Isaac's birth after all this time. In chapter 21, verse 1, it tells us that the Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken. So it does mention that this is the fulfillment of a prophecy, or a promise, but I almost would have expected him, the writer, to deal with it in a more celebratory fashion. It kind of contains then the reference that Abraham gave to Isaac, the son whom Sarah had bore to him, that they circumcised him. But then in verse 6, we have Sarah saying, "God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And so that's why they named the child Isaac, which means laughter. I've also thought it kind of interesting all along that here Sarah talks about her laughter as being laughter of joy because she has had a child. But we know that both Abraham and Sarah have had laughter of ridicule because they did not believe that God was going to fulfill this promise. Abraham in chapter 17, and then Sarah laughs in chapter 18 when the three men come along and make that promise again. So, what is the status of the promise now? They still don't have any really land to call their own. But descendants, they've at least got one child, which was the first thing that was necessary for this promise to show some signs of hope. However, just when we are ready to breathe a sigh of relief, we come to chapter 22. And after all that God has done, it seems that once more God is about to utterly destroy this possibility that he had given them. Let's look beginning in chapter 22. The writer tells us that after these things, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And God said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. The writer here has been very careful in the ways in which he has worded his sentence. God speaks to Abraham. Abraham responds, Here I am. And then he says, Take your son. Not just your son, but your only son, Isaac. In other words, the son who is the fulfillment of the covenant promises. Not just your son, not just your only son, Isaac, but your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. So we've got both of the psychological anguish of Abraham that the writer is trying to point out here, in addition, of course, to the fact that God is now asking Abraham to once again take the fulfillment of that promise, put it on an altar, and burn it up. But yet at the same time, as we can only imagine psychologically what Abraham must have been going through, notice that the writer doesn't actually tell us. As Dr. Arnold points out in his Genesis commentary, there is no description of Abraham's inner emotional state. And so it is kind of, the writer just kind of leaves it up to our own imagination to fill that part in. And so Abraham and Isaac begin heading towards the mountain. They take the wood and so forth. And after 3 days, Abraham looks up. He sees the place and tells his servant to stay here with the donkey so that he and Isaac can go up and worship. It's interesting that at the end of verse 6, as Abraham is giving this instruction to his servants, he tells them, The boy and I will go over there, we will worship, and then we will come back to you. Dr. Arnold's commentary again talks about all of the discussion about this particular phrase that has taken place during the thousands of years. The Talmud, for instance, the Jewish writings suggest that Abraham was displaying prophetic powers here. Medieval interpreters suggested that Isaac was, in fact, killed and then resurrected. The book of Hebrews assumes that Abraham trusted God enough to raise Isaac from the dead. A lot of the church fathers, of course, read this story as a typological indication of Christ. In any case, they continue their journey, and it's also interesting that Isaac asks Abraham, where is the animal that we are supposed to sacrifice? And Abraham responds in verse 8, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. Okay, God will provide can be more literally translated as God will see to it. And sure enough, that's exactly what God does. After the incident is over, once again, God is going to simply come and repeat to Abraham the promise that he has been making so many times. In verse 17, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. So once again, God has almost done away with the promise, and it seems that we are able to breathe a sigh of relief, the confidence that the promise will come true. Dr. Arnold suggests several strands, 3 strands in particular, 3 items in particular that are kind of all drawn together here in the story. First of all, in verse 14, God has said, it tells us, in other words, that God called the place the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Okay, so part of the purpose of the story is to explain the name of that particular place, which must have been significant in their history. Dr. Arnold says the story also explains the reason Israel doesn't practice child sacrifice, but perhaps most importantly in my mind, in the third case, he says in his commentary, this story is about the characterization of Abraham, and once again to describe him as a person of faith. However, again, notice that Abraham is not a person of unflinching faith through the entire story. We tend to think of these Old Testament patriarchs as perfect people of great faith and holiness who give us all a perfect example of how to live our lives. But notice that that's not what happens, is it? I would suggest that the main character of the story is not Abraham, but God. And the covenant comes true only through God's interaction, not just because of Abraham's great faith, but also in the instances where Abraham has slipped up and demonstrate that that faith is not particularly strong. Right after the story of the near sacrifice of Isaac in chapter 22, chapter 23 is going to go on and describe Sarah's death and burial. The ancient Jewish interpreters, some of them said that the reason this story follows immediately on chapter 22 is that Sarah was so disturbed by what Abraham had done that she died. Probably in its context, in its original context, the story is more to explain how it is that Abraham's family comes to own their first piece of the promised land. The story of the negotiation of the place to buy the cave in which he can bury his wife. Scholars have pointed out that this is the first instance in Genesis where Abraham now actually has legal title to a piece of this land that God has promised. The chapter 24 is going to talk about the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah and how Abraham sends his servant up to Haran in order to find a wife from Rebekah so that Isaac does not marry a Canaanite. And then in chapter 25, Abraham is finally going to die before we will transition into the Jacob cycle. So I thank you for joining me for this interesting look. I feel it's always an interesting look to read these patriarchal stories from Genesis. And in the next lecture, we will go on and finish the book by taking a look at the Jacob cycle and at the